right, if everybody's ready, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Christy Walkuski. I'm the director of the Brain Center for Community Engagement here at BW, and I want to welcome you to the Civic Lead series today. Today's session is our fourth session in our summer series focused on racial justice. And thanks, Lisa Green is logged in today. Thanks to Lisa for her session last night. That is all posted along with all of our other sessions at our event page, which is bw.edu/civic. So today's session is also being recorded, just so you're aware, and will be available probably tomorrow at our Brain Center YouTube channel, as well as at our event page, which I just mentioned. Just a little bit of virtual event etiquette. Everybody will remain muted throughout the presentation, but we will be taking questions in the chat box, so feel free to put any questions or comments you might have throughout the presentation there. There will be time throughout for questions, and we would encourage that dialogue. A little bit about the session, about the series. Our goal was really to spark dialogue, to provide connection and encourage informed action, both on campus and in our wider community. And we've shared with every session so far, we recognize that this series is not comprehensive, either in academic perspective or in lived experience. So we've opened the invitation. If you have a story to tell or a topic you'd like to explore through this platform, please reach out to Julie and I. And I've been really happy to say that some folks have been doing that. And so I would encourage you, if you're sitting there with an idea, don't hesitate. We've also heard from some of our former presenters that folks have continued to reach out to them as well for follow-up. So that's the goal here. We recognize that these 1-hour sessions alone are not the answer, or not the be-all end-all. And so we hope that this is just sparking connection and future engagement. Just a reminder that today's event is rooted in the expectations of BW's community standards of conduct. So we expect this to be a space where we can engage empathetically, respectfully, and thoughtfully together. I am thrilled to have 3 fantastic BW colleagues hosting today's session from the Department of Religion. A really brief intro about each of them. Dr. Ellen Posman is the department chair and professor in the religion department who teaches courses on comparative religion, primarily. She also teaches in service learning, which we're happy to have her. Dr. Alan Kolp is the BW Chair of Faith and Life and professor in the religion department who teaches mainly courses on spirituality while also writing a daily inspirational blog and serving as the faculty athletic representative. Dr. John Gordon is an associate professor in the religion department who teaches courses in the areas of biblical studies and religion and popular culture while also serving as the University Chaplain. We appreciate the collaboration of all 3 of you, and I'm looking forward to today's presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Ellen.
Good. Not hearing.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint here that will hopefully work, and hopefully the noise from the storm won't get in the way of what you're hearing from me. You picked a good day to stay inside and come to one of these. You can take a break from yard work. So here we go. First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here, and especially Christy and Julie for allowing us the opportunity to talk about this, and John and Alan in particular, who are not physically by my side, but who have worked with me on this and are here with me and will be fielding questions later. As Christy said, I teach comparative religion, so Christianity is not my specialty, yet most of the presentation is about Christianity. I will present the history and scholarly perspectives on the issue, and then John and Alan, who do specialize in Christianity, will field questions and provide some comments. As I'm presenting, we welcome any comments or questions in the chat area. If you have any already, please put them in the chat area. If you did any of the advanced reading we sent out, which was not at all required, and have questions about that, put it in the chat area. I'm going to try to keep my remarks to about 20 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions and comments. All right. We signed up to do this session about a month ago. And we would be remiss not to mention that we lost 2 civil rights icons last week. They both passed away last Friday. Reverend C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis. They were both they both very much located their struggle for civil rights in religion. Both studied at American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville. Both studied with James Lawson and absorbed the idea that the core of all religions is justice and love. Both committed to nonviolent resistance with love in their hearts and God on their side. Both participated in sit-ins, freedom rides, and the Voting Rights March in Selma, and both were jailed and badly beaten as they did so. There's a quote from each of them on here. The C.T. Vivian quote says, "It was on this plane, the moral and spiritual plane, that the movement first confronted the conscience of the nation." And the quote here from John Lewis is, "If it hadn't been for my belief in God Almighty, the civil rights movement and my own participation would have been like a bird without wings." So I wanted to acknowledge them in this moment. All right. First, some history. One of the things that the Black Lives Matter movement continually says is that we need to know our history. One of the things Contrell Jackson repeated often when he inaugurated this series is how important it is to know our history. And one of the things that is difficult to face about the history of the United States is that it was built on a foundation of racism and white supremacy from the beginning, and it has infected all of our institutions. Religion was no exception to this, and beyond being infected by it, some would argue that it was a major factor in the racist worldview as it justified white supremacy. Some quick examples without spending too much time on this are the following. Pope Alexander VI in 1493 declared what has been termed the doctrine of discovery. The decree stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was open to be, quote, discovered, unquote, by Christian rulers and occupied even if there were people there, so that, quote, the Catholic faith and Christian religion be exalted and be spread, souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to faith itself, unquote. This was used to foster European colonialism and imperialism, and in the US to dehumanize Native Americans as uncivilized and justify taking their lands and forcing conversions and assimilation. Christianity also justified slavery. There are biblical passages about obedience and returning slaves to masters, and a section of the Noah story was used to support white superiority. At first, slaveholders did not offer enslaved people the gospel, dehumanizing them as animals who did not have souls and could not be saved. This shifted to a mandate to convert slaves and save souls, but they utilized a slave Bible, shown here, that took out the Exodus story, took out references to freedom and justice, and emphasized obedience. So this was a particular form of Christianity manufactured to preserve slavery. After slavery ended, Christianity continued to justify white supremacy and segregation, using particular biblical passages to claim white superiority and to theologically claim that God did not want to mix races. Lynchings were held, sometimes on Sundays, on church property, and I am sure you are all aware of cross burnings as an intimidation tactic used by the KKK against African Americans. These are extremely ugly aspects of our history that we need to face up to. So is this just long ago, during the times of slavery and the times of segregation and Jim Crow? Some very fringe Christian groups still hold to these ideas today, such as the extremist denomination known as the Christian Identity Movement. And of course, the KKK still exists and consider themselves to be Christian, but these groups have thankfully been marginalized. There are still institutional structures in church hierarchies that have stood in the way of leadership opportunities for African Americans in some denominations. And there's an interview with Trillian Newbell on CNN provided in the additional resources here, in which she, while doing Southern Baptist outreach, preaches that all humans are created equally and in the image of God, and has encountered overt racism from Christians after she speaks, who come up to her and tell her she is not created equal. One note on racism in non-Christian religions. There's less written about it, but it is there, and not just in the United States. In the United States, Some non-Christian groups who are first treated as lesser due to not being Christian have been what has been termed, quote, bribed with whiteness, unquote, as a way to gain status and reap the benefits of white privilege, but by participating then in systemic racism and a culture of white supremacy. Is there relevance here in the relationship of religion to racial justice in the current moment? Beyond knowing and facing up to history, there's also a sense among many young people, some among the protesters, that institutional religion is corrupted or morally bankrupt and that the movement is or should be secularized. Others argue that religious leaders need to face oppressive pasts and presents and meet young people and protesters where they are, in the streets, to redeem religion itself, rather than claiming a righteousness and insisting that people should come to them for the truth. Thankfully, there is a whole other side to the history that is equally important to know about religion's use in the struggle against racism, or what we are now calling anti-racism. The first example here is slave revolts. Those who were able to have a complete copy of the Bible and interpret it saw that God wanted justice. Nat Turner, pictured here, had visions of God and felt called to fight for God against God's enemies, while Denmark Vesey used the story of the Exodus to advocate a violent overthrow of slavery. John Brown, who was white, was also religiously moved to use armed insurrection to end slavery. Then, of course, there were abolitionists, too many to name. Sojourner Truth, pictured here next to Nat Turner, felt called by God to preach and did so for abolition and women's rights. Closer to home here, John Baldwin, the Methodist preacher who founded our university, called slavery the fundamental sin. And George Huckins, who was in the first graduating class here and went on to become a minister, wrote about how much the sin of slavery needed to be eradicated and how he longed to fight in order to do it, and signed up for the Union as soon as the Civil War started. Denominations at the time split into northern and southern denominations over the issue of slavery. Then there's the independent Black church, which fought segregation. Richard Allen, pictured here next to Sojourner Truth, lived in the North and was an abolitionist with a station on the Underground Railroad. But in 1787 in Philadelphia, he and others protested segregation in the church and started their own denomination, which became the AME Church, and led to other independent Black church denominations dedicated to a Christian message of anti-racism. The Black church was, of course, instrumental in the civil rights movement, providing a place to organize, a moral force, a spiritual calling, and hymns and prayers to embolden activists. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was an inspiring minister who felt God's call and preached God's desire for justice enacted through love. We have already discussed C.T. Vivian and John Lewis, both of whom studied under James Lawson, the rightmost here on the top set of pictures. Reverend Lawson graduated from BW, went to seminary at Oberlin, and went to India where he learned Gandhi's tactics. Martin Luther King Jr. asked him to come to the South, where he taught that the core of all world religions was justice and love, and trained activists in nonviolent resistance and loving one's enemy while doing so. In the late 1960s, James Cone, shown here, bottom left, became the father of what is known as Black theology, which systematized biblical interpretation and theological ideas, some of which were already active in the Black church, about God being on the side of the oppressed and calling for collective liberation and justice. Jacqueline Grant, next to Cone here, who studied under Cone, became known for womanist theology, an intersectional theology that rectifies a lack of attention to Black women's experience in feminist theology and a lack of attention to women's experience in Black theology, as womanist theology aims to uproot all forms of oppression. No, I don't need to do that, sorry. Probably the figure who is the most visible standard bearer of this anti-racist Christianity today is William Barber, the last photo here. He has organized Moral Mondays that protest injustice at the North Carolina State House, and he has been active in the Black Lives Matter movement and protests. Notably, many denominations have voiced support for the movement and recent protests and have committed themselves to doing work for racial justice. Another note on non-Christian traditions. Reverend Lawson, as mentioned, claimed that all religions seek justice, and certainly most, if not all, have tenets related to equality. Some have actively participated in these various anti-racist movements. Meanwhile, in contrast to the idea of the current movement as secularized, some founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Patrisse Cullors in particular, have drawn upon traditional African religion as a source of faith and strength, and have themselves said that the movement is grounded in spirituality. The relevance here is that there is much in religion and spirituality more generally to offer to a movement for racial justice. Turning to vocabulary, what do we mean by racist, non-racist, anti-racist? The first historical slide here was American Christianity as racist, and the second was American Christianity as anti-racist. Scholars would argue that current mainstream American Christianity is neither. It is non-racist, but not anti-racist. It is not actively working against the system. There is a non-racist idea that God created everyone equal, but also mainstream American Christianity tends to be apolitical and understands religion as about personal salvation and an individual relationship with God, but not about being active in social and political issues of this world. Scholars have charged that this position itself is in fact a cover for racism, and particularly structural racism, and was designed purposefully as we moved away from Christian support for slavery or for segregation. This position says that the framing of Christianity is not about any of these this-worldly issues. It was a way to avoid working for justice and to keep the church complicit in racism, and was even intentionally designed to preserve white privilege without being blatantly racist anymore. So this, in a way, is the biggest charge and the biggest issue to face and to deal with. Is the idea that religion is solely or even primarily about individual salvation and an afterlife and a personal relationship to God itself risk or perpetuating systemic racism? And yes, I realize how provocative a question this is, and no one has been maybe more provocative in general than Angela Davis, who you can see here saying, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Now, there are different ways to define racism, and some on the next slide that I won't spend much time on. If one's definition of racism is participating in a system of inequality based on race, whether by action or inaction, then yes, this could be seen as racist. Students often turn to the dictionary as a referee. Notably, Merriam-Webster defines racism as an active belief in superiority of a particular race or active prejudice and discrimination. But it is, in fact, in the process of revising the entry to include a definition that is a system of advantage based on skin color, which we want to term institutional, structural, or systemic racism. So what does that then mean? Can there even be non-racism? Or is it always complicit or never enough? This gets to issues of white fragility, another term being talked about a lot these days, which is used to describe the unwillingness, discomfort, and inability of white people to look squarely at these issues out of the discomfort of feeling like this makes them a bad person, or not knowing what to do about the privileges that one has gained from whiteness. Yet it is important to acknowledge these systemic issues. There are also institutional and economic realities affecting congregations that prevent them from, quote unquote, taking sides or getting more involved. As church membership declines, pastors are afraid of taking activist positions that may alienate members, drive them to go elsewhere, and therefore harm the budget. Clergy are also already very busy with pastoral care, social service commitments, day-to-day responsibilities, and moving services online during coronavirus. They may not think they have the time for anti-racist activities. This concern about alienating congregants by preaching a version of religion they don't recognize leads to the question of what really is religion? Is it about justice? Is it about solely personal salvation? And what do congregants want to hear? John Gordon was good enough to supply all of these definitions from Ibram Kendi's book on anti-racism, and they are here if you want to go back to them. But I'm not going to spend time on them now. Suffice it to say that they use phrases about racism being possible through action or inaction. There is a lot of current discussion about the idea that non-racism within a racist society only perpetuates systems of privilege and oppression and is complicit in racism, so the only moral stance is anti-racist. This brings us to the study we sent out ahead of time. What do congregants want? Do they want religion to deal with justice or not? Presumably focusing on personal salvation, solace, time to feel good and be uplifted. This survey is from before the protests, but in it, while almost 2/3 of African American Christians want sermons and services to regularly address issues of racial injustice, 62%, only about 1/3, or 36%, of white Christians do, and 42% of white Christians specifically do not want these topics discussed. So we have to ask, why is that? On the previous slides, we see some of the answers to this in the history of white Christianity as not taking on issues of justice, framing religion as apolitical, and experiencing fragility and discomfort when discussing race, versus the Black church, which very much has seen the essence of Christianity as working for justice, that one's relationship to God calls one to work toward that beloved community, that kingdom of God on earth. Another way to understand this is to think about it from the academic perspective, the scholarly study of religion, religious studies, which is that religion itself is culturally constructed and contested and open to interpretation. The University of Pittsburgh Religious Studies webpage that we sent out opens this way. You cannot remove religion from culture. Religions generally reflect the cultural views of their time and place. We have seen at least 3 interpretations here already: a racist interpretation, an anti-racist interpretation, and a non-racist interpretation. And each interpretation reflects and reinforces the cultural views of the time. One other side note, we sent out a forum in which current scholars of religion are posting about religion and the racial justice protests. Some of these use sophisticated analyses by invoking scholarly categories and concepts of apocalypse, sacrifice, martyrdom, hope, and more. We certainly don't have time to discuss all of these perspectives here, but we encourage you to check them out. They are fascinating analyses of the current moment. But all of this begs the question of your interpretation of religion. Should religions be political and fight for justice? Should they be apolitical and focus on spirituality and salvation? Does Christianity mandate that we fight for justice? Does Christianity mandate that we focus on higher things rather than the things of this world? And on what basis are you making these judgments? Who gets to decide what a religion is or what it truly means? So, in conclusion, the takeaway points about religion's relevance in this moment are the following. Religion has much to do with the current moment for racial justice in terms of history, theology, ethics, motivational and organizational power, and the faith and hope needed to feed souls during the fight. The Black Lives Matter movement has asked us to know our history and the various ways white supremacy is built into our country and institutions. Religion is no exception and has justified and fueled racism. The Black church and other denominations and religions have fueled the fight for justice with a divine fire. Religion and spirituality can be powerful forces of anti-racism. If religion is a reflection of culture, and Black and white cultures disagree about the purpose of religion, and most white religion is now non-racist and apolitical, what does that say about our culture, and especially white Christian American culture? Is this enough, or is this complicity? Must religion be relevant to racial justice? The answer to this may be very individual. What do you think? Is it relevant for you in this moment? Is it relevant for society? Should it be? And so here are some questions to leave you with. We clearly are not going to have time to discuss all of these today. I imagine you will think about them maybe for a long time to come. Is religion racist, non-racist, anti-racist? Is or should religion be about politics and communal justice, or individual relationships to God? And I realize that's a false binary, and it can obviously be both. Should sermons regularly address racial injustice? What does it mean that African American Christians differ from white Christians regarding whether churches should address racial justice? What is religion, and who gets to decide the true core of a religion? Is religion relevant in our current moment regarding racial justice? And if so, how? Is it relevant for you in whatever religion or spirituality you practice in this moment? And if so, how? And now, of course, most importantly, what are your questions? So I'm going to turn this over to your questions and comments, and to my colleagues, John Gordon and Alan Kolp, who will field some of these from the chat board. I think Christy has also been keeping an eye on the chat board. I hope that this will be a good discussion. We still have about a half an hour to go. Oh, the last two slides here are just resources, additional resources for people to look at, but I wanted to make sure that they get pulled into the recording. And now I'm going to turn the PowerPoint off so that we can see each other.
Ellen. All right, we'll go ahead and go to the chat box here. And Caleb had a question about the pre-reading. And Alan and John, I don't know if you want to field these or if you want me to, if you've taken a look at them.
I can read them and we can take them one at a time, right? So Caleb says, I found in the pre-reading a part that mentioned racial violence and how the abolitionists used religious moral arguments against it and the like. What are your thoughts on how this mirrors when Christian ideology played a large part in the shutting down of the Roman Colosseum death sports, including killing slaves for sport? Alan or John, do you want to take that one, or?
I can't say that I'm that familiar with the role that Christians played in shutting things down. I know that that certainly in popular American culture, the so-called bathrobe epics, Christians were often portrayed as being the martyrs. But I think it is fair to acknowledge that for at least the first 300 to 400 years of the early Christian movement, they were outside of the realm of empire. There were periodic persecutions of them, and it was only with Constantine's so-called conversion that Christianity began to become part of empire itself in terms of its acceptance and approval. And of course, as I think many would acknowledge, from that moment on, Christianity has found itself one way or another embedded in power, since then. And so the martyrdom tradition within early Christianity was powerful. Some of the early martyr stories were circulated widely among early Christian communities as advocating an appropriate faith response to the intrusion of Greco-Roman power.
Yeah, that's where I would have gone, is to recognize that it was only in the 4th century when the Roman Empire began to move towards becoming Christian that the kinds of questions about being a person of faith and being political, sometime in the 4th century and beyond, then the question is, could a good Roman citizen also be a Christian? And when the answer is yes, then that tends to dilute what being a Christian meant. I think that began to probably to put the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible on the back burner. And so religion in the form of Christianity began to support the empire rather than be persecuted by the empire. There's no question in my mind, and my doctoral work was in the early centuries, that the first 3 centuries, by and large, Christianity was threatened, and they were all virtually pacifists. They saw that as part of what it meant to be a Christian, is turn the other cheek and the second mile kind of thing. There's also no question that in those early centuries, there were Christians of all colors. If you think about the map of Africa, the northern part of Africa, along the Mediterranean, was all part of the Roman Empire. And so there would have been Christians of all sorts of hues in terms of what did human beings look like. Jesus himself was part of the Middle East. So it's interesting that Christianity morphed the way it did. And it's in some ways it's a issue that I think in some ways as Christians we're helped by knowing those early century stories, because the stories that we can adopt and help us know how to answer the question. At least that's how I understand it.
Thanks. James has 2 questions, one following up on another. How do you feel about the relevance of less mainstream religious African-American enterprises with regard to the Black Lives Matter movement? I'm thinking of the Nation of Islam, 5 Percenters, and far out on the spectrum, Nuwaubianism. And as a follow-up, should the BLM movement police the religion within, and if so, how?
What was the last part of that one? Something about policing? I didn't quite
Should
get
the
that.
Black Lives Matter movement police the religion within, and if so, how?
I think the first question on the movements that are how did he call it, the mainstream religious African American enterprise. That's an interesting question, and at one level, I would say what I think is true is at least most people that most of us wouldn't even know what those less mainstream religious traditions are. So there would be very significant ignorance. And so if they were doing things, most of us would probably be unaware of it unless it appeared in the news somehow. And so I think one of the ongoing issues in the whole struggle against racism is ignorance. And then once you know, you've got a different kind of issue. I don't know how about the Black movement policing the religion within. That's a really interesting question.
Yeah. I think my understanding is that, at least in part, this has been a response to the perception that to be part of traditional white Christianity is to continue to be denigrated and dehumanized, and that the resources for renewal and inspiration and strength have to come from elsewhere. And so the turn to African religious traditions and others, a kind of eclectic spirituality, which is actually in many ways a good American practice right now. But it is a way of saying that inspiration has to come from elsewhere, and that the stories and the rituals needed to support one's sense of self and one's own spirituality can't come from white Christianity. I think that may be at least a reasonably fair interpretation of what is going on.
Yeah, I see here that you pointed out about Patrice Cullors, and I know I was the one who brought her into this. That I think she is ordained in something called IFA. I might be mispronouncing it. And so but yes, what I understand, and I understand that you're also bringing in Nation of Islam and Black Hebrews who traditionally preach a more separatist understanding of nationalistic religion and whether or not that would fit within the movement. I think I'm kind of with John here. I think people are fed by whatever spirituality works for them. A lot of these movements have benefited from their interfaith cooperation. So, but I recognize that there may be varying agendas. I think one of the things about the Black Lives Matter movement, even though Patrice Cullors is one of the 3 quote unquote co-founders, is that they are actually dedicated to not having a particular leadership model and are trying to move away from that leadership model. And there have actually been faith leaders in the Black church who have come and said, I would love to come into this and help you lead it. And they have said, no, we don't want leadership in that way. It's in fact some of what I would argue is a sort of womanist interpretation that really is very suspicious of leadership in general. And because of that idea of a diffusion model of the movement, I would say everyone who's willing to work for the cause is welcome in their own way. But I don't know exactly. Since there's no one to speak really for the movement, it's always hard to get at those kinds of issues. Caleb had another question about anti-racism. Oh, and Christy asked if she could turn on people's microphones. Absolutely. So if people want to speak rather than try to type, that works too. Why did the definition of anti-racism use itself in the definition? It seemed vague and more party-centric than concrete. Are there other definitions that might be clearer?
Well, I guess, I mean, my attempt to answer that is, of course, we're taking those definitions from Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. If I've understood him correctly, his concern is to kind of meld together action and inaction, and also the clear recognition that we're talking about policy as well as ideas, and that to combat racism is to work at a structural level that acknowledges and confronts what he would call anti-racist policies that are designed intentionally, or I guess even unintentionally, to perpetuate the idea that one group or race of people is superior to another. And so I recognize, yes, in the one he talks about anti-racist policy is part of the definition, but he's very clear, at least if I've read him correctly, that I think Kendi would say there really isn't non-racism. It's either racism or anti-racism. You're either supporting policies and ideas and actions that continue to perpetuate inequity, or you're actively working against and guided by ideas that recognize that there is racial equity or equality. So, don't know if that helps, but at least that's my understanding of what Kendi's trying to say.
And Manji, hi Manji, writes, Christianity says that God loves justice. Shouldn't that be the case in every religion? How would God handle the current culture with what is going on today? Or does that apply today? What would God say? That's a big question. I'm not taking that one. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, if, and I'm going to back into this, but hopefully quickly. I think a couple key issues involved in this whole discussion is how does one even conceive of God? And so that gets for at least Christians hooked up with the Bible, and how do you understand the Bible and how do you interpret it? Clearly, a lot of the disagreement in the 19th century between the abolitionists and the slaveholders was a question of how am I going to be dealing with the Bible? And there's a level at which Mandy's assuming that, yeah, it does say, you know, God loves justice, and I would argue the way I view God and the way I understand Scripture is God demands justice. God is always on the side of those who are working against injustice. So I recognize that's my interpretation, and there really are different interpretations, and there probably will continue to be issues because of that. And then secondly, the whole idea of God, and I think about my own personal life, how my view of God, how I understand God has changed over years, and that's probably true for a lot of people. And if it's not true for you, you're probably working with a really adolescent view of God, would be my guess. As we grow older, that usually gets challenged. So that said, I think the question for me then is, how do I understand it? How do I engage it? So for me then, the view of God and the view of Scripture are two big ones. And quite frankly, the other one is the whole economic thing. If you particularly think about the American scene, and you think about, I'm going to stick with just white Christians since I am one, those of us who are economically fairly well off or comfortable find this whole discussion, there's a lot at stake, so to speak. And that's why I think the challenge is really more than just a religious challenge. And if we don't recognize that, then I really think we miss what's at stake, because often we shape how we think and talk based on how well we're doing or how not well we're doing. And those of us who have, we're comfortable, then that winds up setting this table for the kind of institutional systemic racism that we've seen, and that will, there's, for too many people, there's too much at stake to keep it like it is. So I think that's, for me, the real challenge. And then you start talking about sacrifice, and it's not your sacrifice, it's my sacrifice.
I think the only thing that I would add to Alan's comments are the sense that at least one of the things that I think all religions seek to do is to create a world, to offer a comprehensive way of thinking about life and meaning, and that involves the political, the economic, the social, the spiritual. It involves all aspects of life, and one's definition of God and how God is understood to interact in the world, and God's characteristics, qualities, whatever you want to call it, all that is a part of the innumerable numbers of pieces that go into creating a world. And I think what's happening in this moment is an attempt finally to challenge a world. And to challenge a world is to challenge one's identity and one's place in it. And I think that's what becomes so threatening for so many white Christians and white congregations, is that in the past they've wanted to look at racism as simply a relational issue. I have black friends. I'm not a racist. I don't, do these bad things. I'm trying to be a good person. And they struggle, if at all, to recognize that that a world that's been created is a world built on oppression and supremacy, and that if racism is ultimately going to be eliminated, worlds have to change. and that means our ways of thinking and our ways of acting and our ways of understanding ourselves all have to come under question and be challenged.
I appreciate those comments a lot, both on that move from that personal and on the economic front and the issue of sacrifice. There are some really interesting, I had to make some choices about what to put on the additional resources, and there's actually a book called Dear White Christians that did not make the cut by Jennifer Harvey that talks about moving from ideas of racial reconciliation to churches really dealing with issues of reparations, and whether or not people are willing to make the kinds of monetary and other sacrifices that it would really take to begin to recreate the American situation. VO writes, forgive my naivete, but in the context of the current Black Lives Matter challenges, why wouldn't it be a better approach to move away from the strongly polarized positions and start coalescing around a more middle ground that is common across the various definitions of race and equality? For example, the 10 Commandments as a common ground.
You can handle that one, Ellen.
Yeah, sure. I mean, part of me would be wondering if I would agree that we have a polarized world in any number of ways, and I suspect that I'm going to guess that probably the part of it is I don't think I'm a polarizer, it's the other person. So I don't know whether people think that they're operating from one pole. Particularly if you throw religion into the mix, sometimes people are pretty convinced they're right. So I don't know anybody who's on one end of the polarity who thinks they're wrong, and it's a strongly held opinion and they hope they win. The problem is here, who's right, which often is which interpretation's best. So I couldn't agree more. Let's find, I would probably say middle ground, yeah, but probably ground that's above all of that. I would still be opting in for the kind of vision that we have for not only this country, but this world, the kind of vision. And this is where, for me, it morphs beyond the racial thing into a whole climate thing and sort of the future of the human race. And what I think probably Jesus had in mind, and many of the other luminaries of various religious traditions, is you think about Thich Nhat Hanh and the whole message of love. So why can't we find a way forward as a human race to live a life of love and care and justice? I guess that's probably what Jesus meant by the kingdom, in my estimation. And maybe it's after I die, but I think I have more in mind while I'm still living. I don't want to wait for it. And I think that's where I feel the call to action and to change. And indeed, I don't know that it's so much change as that it will be transformation. And I think that's why it would require sacrifice. And I see Tim Morrison's question about, is there any hope of the institutional church? Some would say, are you kidding? No, it's hopeless. I'm not quite there. I do think that a lot of the hope in the institutional church does rest in what I just said about being transformational. But I do think when you look at the younger generation, which is the group that sits in all of our classes during the school year, even in my religion classes, there's not a big swell of folks hoping that the institutional church makes it. So I think religion will make it. I think spirituality will make it. Whether or not the institutional church will, I don't know. And there's part of me doesn't care, because I'm not sure God cares about that. And that's obviously a statement of interpretation. I'm thinking about a friend of mine who's probably 40, a woman who's very involved in the Black Lives Matter and is studying in a Christian seminary. And in an interview, she said, "My church is in the streets." And that was such a powerful statement for me, because I feel the truth of that in some real way. that's where she's experiencing God at work in the world. That's where she's experiencing the quest for justice. That's where she's trying to live out love with all sorts of people of different colors and different ideologies. And I think, okay, that's a tagline that may have some real truth to it. My church is in the street.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, Alan, and in response to Tim's question, I don't know. I mean, it's been interesting to read Black preachers and Black scholars and others who were suggesting that if the institutional church doesn't take radical steps to change, to investigate itself, to look at its theology, to look at its practices, that it will eventually wither away. We've all heard those kind of comments about the church over the years and maybe even longer. But I think you're probably right that the institutional church, as long as it continues to marginalize itself and as long as it continues to be uncomfortable with and even unwilling to address at what's at the heart of the problem. It isn't just making nice relationships. It isn't coming together for prayer vigils and all those kind of safe things where everybody feels comfortable. It's looking at the heart of what has allowed the church to participate in, if not even be a strong supporter of racism that will bring new life to religious communities. There are those communities that are willing to do those things, but that's, on an individual basis within various denominations. But time will tell.
I think there's also another issue that is not the topic of this discussion, right? A lot of the reason that young people are disillusioned with the institutional church is not because they deem the church as racist, right? They see that racist history as history. And even if the church is not being fully anti-racist right now, it is mainstream, at least non-racist. But there are other issues of equity in church structures related to gender and sexuality, where people feel like the institutional church is not on the side of justice. I find it really interesting that this movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, even though it doesn't have quote unquote leadership, was founded by these 3 African-American women, and that everything that I see in womanist theological scholarship is really about, breaking down all of that and being disillusioned with the ways in which leadership structures have created inequity in different ways in different kinds of churches. And until the institutions can get past that, and I think they can by having the church in the street, by leaders who go into there. On the additional resources, there's a panel discussion done by the Council of Foreign Relations and there's a minister who's one of the panelists named Jacqueline Lewis, who is phenomenal in that. So I encourage you all to go check that out. And the Council of Foreign Relations did a separate panel that did not make the list of additional resources on religion and social change that really talked about the need to go and meet young people where they are, and that if the institutional church has hope of survival, it will need to listen, not just preach, but listen to what's being said about issues of justice.
Yeah, this whole discussion is relevant for me because I think about being in the classroom in another month, and I think, okay, how can I carry this into that as a discussion with students? It's not me telling them anything, but it's hopefully raising good questions for them and really asking them individually and then together as a group. Your generation is going to have this new chance that I think about. I'm old enough, I lived through the 60s, participated in civil rights movements and all that. And part of me sits here in 2020 thinking, gee, I thought we'd be much farther along in this whole process. The hopes I had in the 60s, in some ways, we proved that you could change rules and regulations and all that, but it didn't get at the kind of core issues that we're still dealing with and that's sad. I feel sad, but I'm hopeful, and it's because of the young people that will be sitting in our classes.
Yeah, I wasn't around in the 60s, but in the early 90s, which was my really formative coming of age time, was were the Rodney King riots, and I thought that would inspire the change. And to see that we are exactly where we were has been really saddening. And I agree that this generation does have a chance to truly make change, and that this movement has been the biggest in the world, and whatever it's going to draw. And religion is only one piece of this, and we're happy to present that angle on it. But this is widespread and global, and really has the potential to remake the world if one can hope with that level of hope.
John, I want to give you a chance. I don't know if there's any other concluding remarks, or if anybody else has questions you'd like to either share via chat box or your mic. We've got a few minutes before we conclude.
Hi, Ben. I didn't realize VO was you. So Ben asks, have you ever encountered questions coming from students or others not native born? How are they different in their perspectives given today's topic?
I've had some people in my classes in the past 2 or 3 years from Germany, from England, none that I'm aware of who came from Africa. So in some ways, England is wrestling with the same thing in a little different way than we are, given their history. I think it's an issue in Germany. So it would be interesting. I hope we can continue to get to international students to bring that perspective. And certainly the race issue is particular in the United States as it's particular in England. But the whole question of religion, the meaning of religion, and some of the other issues are really pertinent here, and the international community is, I think, crucial to our well-being. The other thing I could say is as the color of the population in this country continues to change going forward into the next decades, when the white majority begins to slip even further into more of a minority position, it will be interesting to see what that has. That's a kind of a long haul, but it's another place where I actually posit some hope of mine.
I think the only thing that I would add is the few instances when I can recall listening to students from different religious traditions from different countries who have quietly voiced concerns about the way they have been perceived or the way they've been treated, which kind of speaks to both Ellen and Alan's larger perspective that the issue here is not limited to racism. I guess I would say it is the larger question of justice, whether it's related to gender or sexuality or race or whatever it might be, and that international students, the few that I can recall having conversations with, had experienced what they felt were difficult moments in some instances because they were perceived to be of a different religious tradition, and felt the need to kind of fly below the radar as much as they possibly could to avoid confrontation at times. That may not so much on campus, but perhaps out beyond campus, where that. So it still speaks to this issue about othering, about perceiving others different from us in all different kinds of ways as people to be suspicious of and afraid of, as opposed to potential members of our larger and expanding community.
Yeah, I would just add here, so yes, there are the non-Christian international students who have their own experiences here. There are the European students who have a similar issue with European Christianity as we have with American Christianity. I was very careful today, or at least I tried to be very careful to talk about this in the context of white American Christianity and even white European Christianity. And one of the questions on the forum, that video forum from the Council of Foreign Relations that I'm going to keep hyping, is exactly your question, Ben, about Christianities even elsewhere. And there was a discussion about Ethiopian Christianity and how old that is and how different that is than what we have in America, and that Christianity has taken on different shapes and ideas and cultures all over the world that lead to different ideas, and that's exactly why it's so difficult to get at the true Christianity. And the woman in that Reverend Jacqueline Lewis, who keeps trying to come back to the religion of Jesus, as Alan did early on in this early period of Christianity, becomes really helpful. I realize it's 2:01 and we're out of time. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much to Ellen, to Alan, to John for providing this framework and this lens. So I have to share, I've taken one of Ellen's courses, and I remember in that class I always left having learned a lot, but also walking away with a lot more questions, and I feel that way right now. So I appreciate all the questions that you've presented and helping us to think through some of this. So we have a break in the series next week. We will be back in August, and so I hope that you all continue to join, ask great questions, and please continue to share your ideas and connect with one another. So thank you all again. I really, really appreciate the conversation and your willingness to share your perspectives, and I hope folks continue the conversation. We look forward to keeping this going in our classes in the fall as well. So thank you very much. Take
Thanks,
care,
Christy.
everyone. Well, see you in August.
Thank you, Christy.
Thanks.